The rain came down the way it always did in Seattle, not in dramatic sheets, but in a relentless freezing drizzle that found the gap between your collar and your neck and stayed there. It coated every surface in a thin, oily film that caught the orange glow of the sodium street lamps and held it so that the whole waterfront district looked slightly unreal, like a city seen through dirty glass. Officer Ray Bennett had patrolled these streets for a long time. He knew every pothole on the waterfront, every decommissioned loading dock, every gap in the chain-link fencing behind the old harbor cold storage warehouse. He knew the city the way a man knows a house he has lived in long enough to navigate in total darkness. Not with admiration, but with the proprietary familiarity of someone who believes the place belongs to him. He was not a good police officer. He had never been a good police officer. From the very start after his academy graduation, he was the kind of officer who understood the badge as a license rather than a responsibility, a permission slip issued by the city and protected by the union that allowed him to conduct himself on the streets of Seattle according to his own internal set of rules, which bore only a passing resemblance to the ones written in the departmental handbook. He had faced a series of excessive force complaints. Several came from motorists, others came from pedestrians stopped without probable cause. One came from a store owner who had called the police for help and ended up filing the complaint himself. More came from individuals who had been arrested, charged with minor infractions, and then quietly released when the evidence did not hold. Each time the file had landed on the desk of Bill Thompson, union representative for the local precinct, who had been married to Bennett's father's sister for a long time, and who considered Ray Bennett a professional obligation and a personal project. Each time, Thompson had made the paperwork disappear. Thompson was good at that. He had the administrative credentials, the political relationships, and the institutional knowledge of a man who understood exactly where the pressure points were and exactly how hard to press them. He knew which captains wanted to avoid controversy before their pension reviews, which internal affairs investigators could be managed with a carefully worded memo, and which complaint files were thin enough to dismiss on procedural grounds without anyone looking too hard at the substance. Time and again, Bennett had been allowed to walk back out of the building, clip his badge back onto his belt, and return to the streets he considered his. Captain Ed Baxter, commanding officer of the local precinct, was not a corrupt man in the way that Thompson was corrupt. He was something more common, and in many ways more damaging. He was a tired man, close to retirement, who had spent years managing the gap between what the department was and what it was supposed to be, and he had made his peace with that gap by deciding it was not his job to close it. He reviewed Bennett's file when he had to sign the paperwork, when it was put in front of him, and accepted Thompson's assurances with the practiced ease of a man who has learned that some problems resolve themselves if you give them enough time and enough distance. Bennett knew all of this. He counted on it the way a man counts on a floor he has walked across 1,000 times. Not consciously, not gratefully, just with the absolute unthinking confidence of someone who has never once felt it give way beneath him. Late one night, he turned his cruiser onto the service road that ran parallel to the waterfront and drove at an unhurried pace, his eyes moving across the wet concrete and chain-link fences with the practiced scan of a man who was not looking for anything in particular but was very willing to find it. Beside him in the passenger seat, Officer Mike Lawson sat with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes on the dashboard terminal with the careful attention of someone who did not want to be caught watching his training officer too closely. Lawson was fresh out of the academy. He had joined the Seattle Police Department because his grandfather had been a state trooper in rural Washington for a long time, and had retired with a clean record and a reputation the family still spoke of with quiet pride. Lawson had wanted that. His early days with Ray Bennett had introduced a persistent low-grade anxiety into his daily experience of the job that he was still trying to name. "Dead out here," Bennett said, not to Lawson specifically, but to the windshield, to the night. He tapped 2 fingers against the steering wheel in a slow, bored rhythm. "Nothing but freight containers and puddles," he paused. "You know what I hate more than the quiet?" Lawson said nothing. He had learned quickly that Bennett's questions were rarely questions. People who think quiet means everything's fine. Bennett tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning the lane ahead. Quiet means nobody's talking. Doesn't mean nothing's happening. Real police work isn't about paperwork. It's about instinct. You look at a street, you don't read it like a tourist. You read it like someone who knows what doesn't belong. He turned the cruiser onto the narrow lane that ran behind the defunct harbor cold storage building. The headlights swept across a rusted loading dock, a cluster of industrial recycling bins, a stretch of cracked asphalt glistening under the rain. His eyes moved to the end of the lane and stopped at the far end where the service alley between the harbor building and the next warehouse ran east toward the waterfront. A figure stood motionless against the wall, dark jacket, low cap, hands in pockets, still. "Well," Bennett said softly, and the boredom left his voice like water draining from a glass. "There we go." Lawson squinted through the rain-beaded windshield. "Looks like someone's staying out of the weather. Looks like someone who doesn't belong in this part of the waterfront at this hour." Bennett's hand moved to the light bar switch. "That's the difference between you and me, Lawson. You see a man. I see a question that needs answering." He brought the cruiser to a halt at the mouth of the alley, angled it to block the exit, and switched on the vehicle's spotlight. The light hit David Cole like a physical thing. He had been standing in that alley for a while, absolutely motionless in the specific way that years of fieldwork had taught him to be. Still, but not rigid, not tense, but settled. Occupying the space with a quality that the human eye reads as belonging rather than waiting. The rain did not bother him. The cold did not bother him. He had stood in far worse conditions in places where the consequences of being noticed were considerably more permanent than a police interaction on a wet Seattle street. He was a veteran of the FBI Organized Crime Division, former Army Ranger. He had the physical bearing of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades being required to be ready for anything at any moment. The kind of controlled economy to every movement that comes not from size, but from the permanent bone-deep understanding that force is a resource you do not waste. Tonight he wore a tattered canvas jacket, gray and formless with a torn shoulder seam he had carefully frayed some time earlier. Beneath it, a dark flannel shirt and worn jeans, boots that had seen better years, a knit cap pulled low. He had spent considerable time cultivating this appearance. Not a costume, but an identity lived in and inhabited with the commitment a serious actor brings to a long-running role. Except the consequences of breaking character here were measured in lives and federal prosecutions, not reviews. His target was a weapons trafficking cell operating out of the converted harbor cold storage warehouse a few blocks east. The cell was moving stolen military-grade firearms through a distribution network stretching from Seattle north to other cities and east across the state. The cell's logistics coordinator, a man known only as Crossfield, had been David Cole's focus for some time. That night he was scheduled to make contact with a mid-level courier known as the Mechanic. A man dissatisfied enough with his arrangement to be flipped into an informant. A short window, that was all he needed. Sewn into the lining of his collar, carefully and invisibly, was a passive audio transmitter no larger than a coin. Set to local encrypted recording to avoid the cell's RF sweep equipment, it would capture everything onto a miniaturized flash drive embedded in the fabric. The Bureau would retrieve it when the operation concluded. His pulse was measured, his mind was clear. Then the spotlight hit him. David Cole processed the situation in an instant. Seattle PD cruiser angled to block the alley exit. 2 officers, high-intensity stop. The protocol for deep cover encounters with local law enforcement was unambiguous. Comply. Fully submit to the stop. Allow the Bureau to clean it up afterward. Attempting to identify himself carried an unacceptable operational risk. If anyone connected to the cell was watching this alley, a credential reveal would blow months of work in under a minute. He turned toward the light, raised his hands to shoulder height, and waited. Bennett got out of the cruiser before the engine had fully settled, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had already decided what was happening before he had confirmed any of it. His hand rested on his taser holster, not drawing it, but touching it the way some men touch a doorframe as they pass through. "Hands, now." His voice bounced off the alley walls. "Get them out of your pockets." "They're already up, officer." David Cole's voice was careful, not meek, not authoritative, the slightly exhausted register of a man used to navigating exactly this kind of encounter. Both hands at shoulder height. "I'm not moving." Bennett covered the distance in quick strides. Behind him, Lawson climbed out and positioned himself at the cruiser's hood, one hand on his belt. The spotlight at his back cast their shadows long and distorted against the brick. "What are you doing out here?" Bennett stopped a short distance from David Cole and performed a quick visual sweep. Up, down, pockets, waistband, hands. "This facility's been closed for years. Nobody's got any business in this alley at this hour. Trying to stay out of the rain, David Cole said. He kept his hands visible, every movement deliberate and telegraphed. I know it's private property. I'll move on. You'll move when I tell you to move. Bennett stepped closer, using his physical presence the way he used most of his advantages as a first language before words became necessary. Face the wall, hands flat. David Cole turned. He placed both palms flat against the cold, wet brick of the harbor building. He spread his feet to shoulder width. He said clearly, without urgency, Officer, I need you to know that I have identification in my left breast pocket. I'd like permission to reach for it. I didn't ask you about your pockets. Bennett began the pat-down, rough, deliberate, less about safety and more about dominance. His hands moved down David Cole's sides, his back, his waistband. They found the firearm. It was a Bureau-issued Glock 19, carried concealed in a modified inside waistband holster, authorized and documented in David Cole's operational file, but invisible to Ray Bennett, who saw only one thing: an unidentified man in a dark alley with a concealed handgun. Everything shifted. Gun! Bennett's voice cracked. He stepped back, drew his taser, the red laser dot swinging to David Cole's back. He's armed, Lawson said, weapon drawn now. Behind them, Lawson's hand had gone to his holster. He drew, aimed at David Cole's back with hands that were not entirely steady. Don't move. Do not move. It is not what you think, David Cole said, keeping his palms flat against the brick, making no movement whatsoever. I have identification, left breast pocket. Please let me show you. The only thing you're going to show me, Bennett said, moving back in close, is exactly how fast I can end this. He did not wait. The first impact came without warning. Bennett drove his forearm hard into the back of David Cole's neck, using his full weight and forward momentum, slamming David Cole's face into the brick with a force that split his lower lip instantly and sent a white explosion of pain across his vision. The metallic taste of blood flooded his mouth immediately. David Cole's combat instincts cataloged his options in the time it took to draw a breath. He could break Bennett's wrist with his left hand and create space in an instant. He could use the brick wall as leverage, turn into the officer's weight, redirect the force, and have Bennett on the ground in moments. He could neutralize Lawson, the rookie, untested hands, not steady, in another couple of seconds. He had done harder things in darker places with less preparation. He didn't move, because doing so would mean assaulting 2 Seattle police officers in an active undercover capacity, federal charges. That would be difficult to untangle, regardless of context, and blowing an investigation that had cost the Bureau significant resources and at least one compromised informant. And because a panicked rookie was already aiming at his back at close range, the calculus arrived at a single conclusion. Take it. Trust the transmitter, trust the protocol, trust the Bureau. Hold. Bennett kicked his right ankle out from under him, a sharp, vicious sweep that dropped David Cole's right knee to the wet asphalt. He grabbed David Cole by the collar and pulled him backward off the wall and threw him down. The back of David Cole's skull hit the ground and the world swam. Not blackness, just a nauseating displacement of vertical and horizontal. As his brain registered the impact and sent signals that all said the same thing: this is bad, this is getting worse. Do not lose consciousness. He did not. He curled instinctively, protecting his vital organs, tucking his chin, making himself as small as possible. Not from fear, but from training, from the deep muscle knowledge of how a body survives sustained blunt trauma. Bennett drew his baton. He brought it down across David Cole's ribs. The sound it made was a short, dense crack, and the pain that followed was interior. It lived inside his chest cavity, wrapped around his breath and squeezed. David Cole's body tried to gasp and could not manage it fully. Wait, Lawson started, taking a half step forward. He's down. He's not. Watch the perimeter, Lawson. Bennett's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man doing something he had done before and expected to do again. This isn't your part. Lawson stopped. He took a step back. He watched. The baton came down again, shoulders, then the upper back. David Cole gritted his teeth against the sounds his body wanted to make. His hands had moved to protect his head automatically. Through the rain and blood and the pounding of his own pulse, he could hear his voice, quieter than he intended because he did not have the air to make it louder, saying the 2 words that constituted the entirety of his available legal recourse in that moment. Federal agent. The rain swallowed them. The baton did not pause. Bennett knelt. He pressed his knee into David Cole's broken ribs with his full weight, finding the specific spot that caused the most concentrated pain, and he leaned down until his face was close to David Cole's ear. His breath smelled of stale coffee and something chemical like industrial cleaner. "You are nothing," he said quietly, in the tone of someone saying something they genuinely believe. "You are one more piece of garbage on my waterfront. And when I'm done with you tonight, you are going to disappear into a system that will hold you for a very long time, and nobody is going to look for you." He stood. He raised his boot. David Cole saw the shadow of it crossing the narrow column of light from the cruiser's spotlight. He had time to see it clearly, to understand what it meant, to understand that he could not stop it, and to think with the strange clarity that sometimes arrives in the last moment before serious injury about the transmitter in his collar and whether the Bureau would find it in time. Then the boot came down and the light went out. For a brief moment, the alley was very quiet. Bennett stood over the unconscious man at his feet and breathed slow, deliberate breaths, the exhale slightly longer than the inhale, the physiological routine of a man returning from a place of elevated intensity. He looked at his baton. He looked at the dark, still shape on the wet asphalt and felt as he had felt in the aftermath of each previous incident in his file. The particular cold satisfaction that he had long since stopped trying to examine. Then he got to work. The first thing was the body camera. He pressed the full deactivation button on his chest-mounted unit, not standby, the full deactivation, and the small red recording light blinked off. He had done this after excessive force incidents before. Each time the deactivation had been logged in the department's digital record system as a battery malfunction. Each time Bill Thompson had reviewed the log. Each time Bill Thompson had amended the notation to reflect the acceptable explanation. This was another instance. He walked back to the cruiser where Lawson stood still at the hood, still holding his weapon, his face doing something complicated that Bennett did not have time for. "Holster it," Bennett said. "Encounter's over." "Is he—" Lawson started. "He's breathing. Call it in." Bennett reached for the radio. "Officer safety incident, armed suspect apprehended, medical transport required." Standard language. "Say it exactly like that." Lawson had not holstered his weapon yet. He was still looking at the figure on the ground. "He said he had ID. He said it twice." "Before you, Lawson." Bennett's voice did not rise. It simply changed quality the way a temperature changes in a room when a window opens. Not dramatic, but immediately uncomfortable. "Look at me." Lawson looked at him. He was armed. He resisted. He took a fighting stance and made a movement toward my belt. Bennett said each sentence with the unhurried deliberateness of someone laying tiles. "That is what happened tonight. That is what your camera recorded because you positioned yourself at the perimeter, which means your footage shows exactly what I needed it to show." Lawson was quiet. Something moved behind his eyes. "You have been on the job for a short time," Bennett continued. "You have no record, no complaints, no union protections yet, and no senior officer who is going to stand up for you if this gets complicated. I have years on the job, a union rep who has made serious problems disappear, and a captain who would rather eat glass than deal with a misconduct investigation." He let that sit. "You back my report, or you don't have a career to develop. Are we clear?" Lawson's jaw was tight. He looked at the unconscious man in the alley. He looked at Bennett. He nodded. And in the nodding, in the moment it took for him to make that choice, something settled into Mike Lawson's chest that would stay there heavy and permanent. He did not know yet that it would eventually become unbearable. He only knew that he was nodding and that the nodding felt like the worst thing he had ever done. Bennett turned back to the radio and called it in, the language exact, the specific phrasing of prior incident reports distilled into a short transmission. He collected David Cole's tattered canvas jacket, the wallet that had fallen onto the asphalt, and the Bureau-issued Glock 19, bagging them in evidence marked John Doe, unknown armed suspect. In the column marked identifying documents he wrote none found. He did not check the breast pocket of David Cole's jacket. He wrote the evidence log in the car while they waited for the ambulance, his handwriting measured and unhurried in the blue-white glow of the interior lights. A short distance behind him, a woman named Doris Kane stood inside the harbor building's loading dock exit, watching through the chain-link gap. She worked the overnight cleaning shift and had been waiting for the rain to ease before walking to her car. She had been there since before the cruiser's spotlight came on. She had seen the stop. She had seen the man comply. She had seen what came after. She took out her phone. She looked at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she put it back in her pocket. Not because she did not care, but because she had learned through a lifetime of living in a city that mostly looked through her rather than at her, that caring and being able to do something about it were not always the same thing. She walked to her car in the rain, her keys in her hand, the sound of the ambulance growing in the distance behind her. She drove home. She did not sleep. In the morning, she would call the FBI field office from her kitchen table with a cup of tea she did not drink, and she would leave a message, and she would not know whether anyone would call back. But she would call because a lifetime had also taught her that the only thing worse than not being heard was not speaking. The first thing David Cole was aware of was the smell, bleach and iodine and the particular antiseptic flatness of recycled hospital air, cold, slightly stale. He had woken up in hospital rooms before, and his body knew what the smell meant before his conscious mind caught up with it. You are horizontal, you are in a controlled environment, you are alive. He tried to move his right arm and heard the chain before he felt the cuff. He forced his left eye open. His right was swollen fully shut. A tight, hot, rhythmic pressure that told him the orbital bone had taken a significant impact. The fluorescent lights burned his retinas. He lay still for a moment, assessing before moving, taking slow and careful stock. Fractured ribs, at minimum a couple, possibly more. Every shallow breath arrived with a precise, localized pain on the left side of his chest. The back of his skull was tender in the way that suggests a significant concussion, and his vision had a slight lag to it. The visual processing delay of a brain that had absorbed a serious blow and was compensating. Dried blood on the left side of his face from the brick. He took a moment to complete the inventory, then he turned his head and looked at the room. Ray Bennett was sitting in the visitor's chair in the corner of the room, casually scrolling through his phone with the relaxed posture of a man who was very comfortable in a situation that was very uncomfortable for everyone else. When he heard David Cole's movement, he looked up and a smile moved across his face. Slow, satisfied, the smile of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has prepared things to say. "Sleeping Beauty," Bennett said, setting down his phone and walking to the foot of the bed. "Doctor says you've got fractured ribs, a severe concussion, and a cracked orbital bone." He tilted his head. "Personally, I think you got off light." David Cole said nothing for a moment, the transmitter still in the collar. He could feel the slight weight of it through the fabric still against his neck. The Bureau's protocol for active undercover operations required a transponder signal check at regular intervals when an agent was in the field. He looked at the clock on the wall above the door. It had been some time since the stop at minimum. In a field operation with a scheduled contact window, Supervisory Special Agent Rachel Bennett would already know something had gone wrong. The question was not whether the Bureau was coming. The question was how long he had to survive this room before they did. "You didn't check the pocket," David Cole said. His voice was raw and gravelly, but it was steady. Bennett laughed, dry and dismissive. "Check what? Your fake ID? Your street credentials?" He moved around the side of the bed, arms folded, looking down at David Cole with proprietary satisfaction. "Your coat and your wallet are in an evidence bag at the precinct. You're being processed under John Doe until AFIS kicks back your prints. But here's what your future looks like. Illegal possession of a concealed firearm, resisting arrest, assaulting a police officer, and whatever else seems appropriate by the time I finish the report." He tapped the clipboard on the tray table. "I write the narrative, buddy. And in my narrative, you reached for my weapon. You're going away for a very long time." David Cole rested his head back against the thin pillow, his good eye fixed on Bennett with the quality of attention that has nothing theatrical about it, no performance of defiance, just a clear, direct, patient regard, the way you watch something you know is going to happen eventually. "You're a dead man walking, Bennett," he said quietly, not as a threat, as an assessment. Bennett's expression shifted. A flicker of something behind the smugness, quickly suppressed, replaced by a harder version of the same expression. He stepped forward and grabbed the bed rail with both hands, leaning over the bed, closing the space between them. "You want to catch another beating in here, tough guy? Because I will." He held there for a moment, his face close, his breathing slightly elevated. Then he straightened, adjusted his duty belt, and walked back to his chair with the casually confident stride of a man who has just won an argument. After Bennett picked up his phone and the room settled into its particular quality of silence, the silence of a man who believes he has the only power in it, David Cole turned his face toward the wall. He stayed that way for a long moment, not from defeat, but from the specific effort of containing something that had no useful outlet in this room, in these cuffs, with this man a short distance away. He had been trained to manage fear. He had been trained to manage pain. Nobody had ever specifically trained him for this. The experience of lying in a hospital bed broken in several places, listening to the man who had broken him make casual remarks, and being required by every professional and tactical consideration available to him to do absolutely nothing about it. He breathed in. He breathed out. Then he looked at the clock on the wall, calculated the bureau's next transponder window, and went back to waiting. He was very good at waiting. He had never hated it more than he did in that moment. And he allowed himself exactly that, the private, wordless acknowledgement of what this actually cost, before he put it away and went back to work. Supervisory Special Agent Rachel Bennett had been at her desk in the Seattle field office since the early hours, not because she had been called in, but because a scheduled undercover contact window existed involving one of her best agents. And Rachel Bennett did not wait at home when her agents were in the field during sensitive operational windows. Her monitoring terminal flagged the first anomaly. David Cole's transponder signal had gone offline. She looked at the terminal for a few seconds. Then she began working. She called across the room to analyst Sarah Jenkins. Pull dispatch logs for the waterfront sector from a short while ago to current. Cross-reference with any Seattle PD radio traffic from the harbor facility vicinity. The cross-reference took a few minutes. A Seattle PD officer safety call from the waterfront sector. Armed suspect apprehended. Medical transport requested. Subject transported to Harborview Medical Center. David Cole's transponder re-established signal. Fixed position at Harborview Medical Center on an upper floor. Rachel Bennett did not convene a meeting. She called the federal duty judge directly, stated David Cole's name and assignment classification, and had a no-knock warrant for the local precinct evidence locker authorized quickly. Quick response team assembled and in vehicles shortly after. She pulled David Cole's personnel file one more time before walking out. Not to review it, but to hold it for a moment. The way you hold something to confirm it is real and solid and worth what you're about to do for it. His Ranger record, distinguished service commendations, completed undercover operations that had resulted in major federal prosecutions. She put the file down, picked up her jacket, and walked out of the office. She didn't spend time imagining what she was going to find in that hospital room. She had learned over her career that imagining what you are going to find is a way of preparing to feel something. And feeling something is a function best performed after the work is done, not before it. Captain Ed Baxter arrived at the hospital room shortly after. He reviewed Bennett's account in a short time and signed off on transport to central lockup without meeting David Cole's eye. He was a tired man who had learned to manage distance from things that required it. And he had managed it that night the way he always did, efficiently, without asking questions whose answers might complicate the distance. He was in the elevator when the sound changed in the corridor above him. Heavy, synchronized, not hospital footsteps, the particular deliberate cadence of people moving with unified purpose through a confined space. He pressed the button for the upper floor and rode up toward it with the expression of a man who has spent a long time telling himself that retirement would make everything simpler, and who has just understood with complete and irreversible clarity that it will not. The elevator opened. He stepped out. He heard Rachel Bennett's voice, and the rest of his career began its end. The corridor on the upper floor of Harborview Medical Center went quiet before the team reached it, not a hush, a suppression, as though the ordinary ambient sounds of the building had recognized something and stepped aside for it. The overhead lights seemed in some way that was probably optical illusion to sharpen. A nurse at the station a short distance from the room stood up from her chair and pressed her back against the counter. The footsteps were heavy and synchronized. The deliberate cadence of people who had done this before and understood that the sound itself was information, that it communicated in advance of anything visible the scale and the certainty of what was arriving. The door to the room did not open. It was pushed with a force that came from a tactical agent's flat palm, moving at full extension. Not violent, not destructive, but absolute. And it swung back and hit the doorstop hard enough to crack the plastic casing from the wall. The room filled. Several federal agents in full tactical configuration moved through the doorway in a fluid sequence. Black tactical pants, heavy Kevlar carriers with FBI stenciled in white letters across the chest. Drop-leg holsters with Sig Sauer P. 320s. They took the corners of the room with 2 steps each, positioned themselves to cover every angle, and went still. The whole entry took a brief moment. Ray Bennett had not moved from the side of the bed. His coffee cup was in his right hand. He looked at the agents, and his face did something complicated. Not yet understanding, not yet afraid, something in between. The expression of a man whose mental model of the situation has just been presented with information that does not fit inside it. Through the wall of agents, with the unhurried certainty of someone who does not need to move quickly because she has already won, stepped Supervisory Special Agent Rachel Bennett. She wore a charcoal suit. She did not hold up her credentials. She did not need to. Her posture, her pace, the quality of attention she brought to the room communicated her authority more completely than any badge could. Her eyes moved across the room once, a single comprehensive sweep, and then fixed on the bed. She walked to the bedside. She looked at David Cole. She looked at the swollen eye, the bandaged ribs visible where the hospital gown gaped, the cuffs chaining his wrist to the rail with the no-slack tightness of someone who had applied them with unnecessary force. She looked at his face. The dried blood, the split lip, the careful, measured expression of a man who had been holding himself in one piece by force of will for some time and had the discipline to keep doing it until help arrived. "Agent Cole," she said. Her voice was level, clear, and carried into every corner of the silent room. "What is your status?" The word agent hit the room like a physical object. David Cole looked at her. Through one eye, with a face that had been through significant violence in the past hours, he managed something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. "Cover's blown, boss," he said. His voice was rough from the bruised throat and the blood he had swallowed and the simple exhaustion of holding himself in one piece. "But I'm still breathing." For a moment, the room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent light above the bed was audible. Then the moment broke, and several things happened at once. Captain Baxter, who had followed the agents through the door and positioned himself near the frame, let his hand drop from his reading glasses. His face performed a rapid, involuntary rearrangement from confusion to recognition to comprehension, to something that went beyond dismay into the territory of a man who has just understood the full weight of what he allowed to happen on his watch. He turned his head slowly toward Bennett. Bennett was standing at the bedside of the man he had beaten unconscious in a waterfront alley a short time earlier, and his mouth was open. The coffee cup was still in his hand. His brain was working. David Cole could see it working, could see the specific quality of his silence, which was the silence of a man processing the rapid collapse of a structure he had considered permanent. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers. It hit the linoleum with a sharp crack, and the lid popped off, and brown liquid spread across the floor in a slow, widening arc across Bennett's polished black boots. He did not look down at it. He stood in the spreading puddle and stared at Rachel Bennett's open credentials case, at the words, "Federal Bureau of Investigation," printed on an identification card that bore a photograph of the man he had spent the past hours calling John Doe. He had not just beaten a vagrant. He had beaten a veteran of the FBI while that agent was conducting an authorized federal undercover investigation. He had stolen federal property. He had instructed a junior officer to falsify his report. He had applied his body camera deactivation protocol with the help of his uncle's administrative credentials. And he had done all of it in front of a passive audio recorder that had been running continuously since the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. The full weight of it took a few seconds to reach his face. "Unlock him," Rachel Bennett said. She was not looking at Bennett. She was looking at the cuff on David Cole's wrist, and the quality of her stillness was the quality of someone exercising very deliberate control over what they would and would not allow themselves to express in this particular moment. Bennett did not move. He could not. "I said unlock my agent, now." One of the tactical agents produced a pair of heavy bolt cutters. He positioned them around the chain link with professional ease and cut it with a single, clean, resonant snap. Another agent moved in immediately with a trauma assessment kit. Baxter had finally found his voice, though it trembled. "Agent Bennett, I want you to know I was not aware of any federal operation in that sector. If I had known—" "Captain," Rachel Bennett's voice was not unkind. It was simply definitive. "There is no internally anymore. Jurisdiction over the assault of a federal officer does not exist at the precinct level." She glanced at her watch. "As of a short time ago, a federal evidence response team is executing a no-knock warrant at your precinct building. They are securing the evidence locker, freezing the digital network, and pulling every access log and camera record in the building." She paused. "Including the disciplinary records database." Baxter went very still. "Baxter." Bennett found his voice, and when he did, it came out wrong, too loud, the voice of a man whose panic had arrived faster than his judgment. "You can't do this. I am a Seattle police officer. I have rights. I need my union rep. Bill Thompson. Call Bill Thompson." "Officer Bennett," Rachel Bennett said, and she turned to face him fully. "You are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law. You are under arrest for assault on a federal officer. You are under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation." "I want my union rep," Bennett said, and now the loudness had a different quality. Not anger, but fear wearing the costume of anger. "I want Bill Thompson." "Turn around," said one of the agents, moving toward him. "Hands behind your back." Bennett did not turn around. For a moment he stood in the spreading pool of his spilled coffee and held his ground, and something moved across his face. The refusal of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not escape. Then the two agents took him by the shoulders, turned him efficiently, and pressed him forward against the wall. The handcuffs clicked into place. The sound was metallic and precise and final, and it rang in the silent room for a moment before it faded. David Cole from the bed watched. He had pushed himself up to a partial sitting position, one arm braced against the mattress, his good eye following the arc of the moment with the careful attention of someone who has waited for something for a long time and wants to be present when it arrives. From the doorframe, Captain Ed Baxter watched the tactical agents walk Ray Bennett toward the door. Bennett's shoulders were rigid, his chin up, performing a dignity the moment had already stripped from him completely. He passed close to Baxter, and their eyes met briefly. Baxter's face holding the expression of a man confronting without the luxury of distance what he had been complicit in. And then Bennett was through the door and gone. The corridor swallowed the sound of his footsteps. The room was quiet. Bill Thompson called the defense attorney from the precinct parking lot before he went inside. He was already framing, already working the phones, already doing what he had done before, managing the first hours. Because the first hours were the hours that shaped everything that came after. He explained the situation to the attorney in a few sentences. The attorney's response was immediate. They would frame Bennett's account as a split-second use-of-force decision by a veteran in a high-risk environment against an unidentified armed suspect. They would note the suspect's failure to identify himself, his failure to comply with repeated lawful commands, the discovery of an illegal concealed firearm. They would get ahead of the narrative before any journalist could establish an alternative frame. Thompson ended the call and walked into the precinct with the settled confidence of a man who has done this before and expects to do it again. He was a few steps inside the building before he saw the federal agents, several of them working in pairs moving through the precinct with methodical efficiency. One pair at the evidence locker, one pair at the IT terminal in the records room, others in the main bullpen, more in the equipment room documenting every item in the camera checkout log. They move the way people move when they have a warrant and a timeline and have done this work many times before, without drama, without hurry, without any of the uncertainty that Thompson's presence was intended to inject into a situation. A lead agent approached before Thompson reached the inner door. "Sir, this facility is currently under a federal warrant. I need to see your identification and I need you to remain in the lobby until I've confirmed your authorization level." Thompson drew himself up. Years of the union's brand of institutional authority had given him a posture and a tone that had in the past been sufficient to redirect most conversations. "I am the senior union representative for this precinct. These are my members, and they have rights. You do not have the authority to—" "This is the warrant." The agent held it out. Clean, signed, federally authorized, with a scope that covered every inch of the precinct's physical and digital infrastructure. "You're welcome to read it in the lobby." Thompson read the warrant. He read it carefully because he was a man who understood documents and because the specific language of a warrant told you exactly how much trouble you were actually in. He read it twice. Then he sat down in one of the lobby chairs, placed his leather portfolio on his knees, and called the defense attorney back. "It's federal," he said when the attorney answered. "Full scope, digital records, physical evidence, camera logs." A pause. "Yes, everything." He sat in the lobby chair and waited, and for the first time in a series of incidents, the wait had a quality to it that was entirely different from all the previous waits. The FBI's evidence response team reached David Cole's tattered canvas jacket shortly after. It was in the evidence locker tagged under John Doe, unknown armed suspect, bagged with the wallet and the Glock. The technical specialist assigned to the jacket was a bureau forensic examiner who had been processing undercover agent equipment for years. He recognized the transmitter before he finished examining the collar. He extracted the drive with the care of someone removing something irreplaceable, ran it through the decryption protocol using David Cole's operational code, confirmed the timestamp and integrity of the recording chain, put on his headphones, and listened. He listened for a while without moving. When he took the headphones off, he looked at the lead agent who had accompanied him. His expression by that point in his career was not usually a readable thing. It was readable now. "Get Bennett," he said simply. The audio was devastating in the specific way that evidence is most devastating when it is not ambiguous. It began with the cruiser spotlight activating and Bennett's voice commanding David Cole's hands from his pockets. It captured David Cole's compliance word for word, both announcements of the identification in his breast pocket, clear and unmistakable beneath the rain. It captured the sounds of the pat-down, the discovery of the firearm, and then the sounds, not described, not interpreted, simply recorded, of a man being beaten with a baton on wet concrete, while his voice said "federal agent" twice and was ignored both times. It captured Bennett's words during the key moments, every syllable preserved. But the transmitter audio was not the only thing the evidence response team found. The second thing was in the digital records. The Bureau's digital forensics specialist approached the records the way an archaeologist approaches a site where the most important artifacts are not the visible ones, but the ones that have been deliberately removed. He pulled the precinct's full camera system log, every body camera activation, every deactivation, every record modification for a long period. Bennett's body camera deactivation was there, time-stamped exactly as Bennett had executed it, and exactly as it had been logged on prior occasions under the notation battery malfunction. What was also there was the subsequent modification a short time later. A login event appeared in the disciplinary records database. The credentials belonged to Bill Thompson, union representative, who had been issued administrative access for the legitimate purpose of reviewing filed complaints. Those credentials had been used from a precinct terminal to access Bennett's disciplinary file. A notation had been added to the body camera deactivation record identical in language to the prior notations. Thompson had done it from the precinct's own system, logged in under his own name, while David Cole was handcuffed to a hospital bed. The specialist pulled the access log and cross-referenced every instance of Thompson's administrative credentials being used with the dates of Bennett's filed complaints. In multiple instances, the credentials had been used within a short period of a complaint being filed. In several of those, the complaint had been subsequently modified, notated, or transferred to a status category that effectively suspended its processing indefinitely. Thompson had not just been protecting Bennett that night. He had been protecting him for years in the very system designed to expose what he was doing, logged in under his own name. The specialist looked at the full log for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Then he flagged every relevant record, saved the complete documentation package to the Bureau secure server, and called Rachel Bennett. "We have the transmitter audio," he said, "and we have something else." The Federal Holding Facility Visitation Room was functional in the way that all such facilities were functional. Adequate, institutional, designed for the temporary processing of people whose circumstances had recently changed significantly for the worse. The acoustics gave every sound a slightly too direct quality. The defense attorney sat with his leather portfolio open in front of him and watched Ray Bennett across the metal table with the expression of a man performing a service he was paid to perform and was very good at, but who was developing significant concerns about the trajectory of this particular situation. Bennett looked worse than the attorney had expected, not physically. Bennett had not been mistreated in holding, but in the specific way that men look when they have been running on certainty for a long time, and the certainty has been abruptly removed. The arrogance was still there in the set of his jaw, but it was performing now, which was different from simply being there. "Tell me again," the attorney said, "about the moment you found the weapon." Bennett told him. The account was smooth, practiced, consistent, the account of a man who had generated similar accounts before. The attorney made a note. Then he opened his laptop, turned it toward Bennett, and pressed play. The audio filled the small room with an immediacy that no courtroom would have matched in this space. With no distance, the sounds were simply present. Rain. Then Bennett's voice. Then David Cole's voice, steady and compliant, announcing the identification in his breast pocket with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. Then the sounds of the baton. Bennett's face changed while he listened, not dramatically, but something behind his eyes adjusted, recalculated, arrived somewhere it had not been before. The attorney stopped the playback. "He told you he had ID," the attorney said. He was not accusatory. He was a lawyer establishing a fact. On the recording, before any physical contact, before the weapon was discovered, he announced it clearly. Then the physical contact began. Bennett's jaw was tight. The situation was, "I also need to tell you," the attorney said, cutting across him with practiced smoothness, "about Bill Thompson." He turned to a new page on his legal pad. The FBI's digital forensics review of the precinct record system has documented multiple instances in which Thompson's administrative credentials were used to modify or suppress filed complaints against you. The access log timestamps correspond directly with complaint filing dates. His login appears a short time after the incident modifying your body camera deactivation record. He let that sit for a moment. This constitutes separate counts of civil rights conspiracy under federal statute. He paused. "Bill Thompson is currently being interviewed in a room in this building." Bennett's head came up. "He's here?" 2 floors up in an interview room. Bill Thompson sat across from 2 federal agents with his leather portfolio on the table in front of him, closed. He had arrived expecting a conversation, the kind he had navigated dozens of times over years in rooms not unlike this one, with people who had institutional leverage, but not quite enough of it. He had arrived with the specific confidence of a man who considers himself very good at his job. The agents did not raise their voices. They opened a laptop and showed him the access log. Every credential use, every modification, timestamp, every deleted complaint entry in precise chronological order, his own login ID on every line, entry after entry after entry, years of Bennett's complaint files systematically managed, the dates lined up with the precision of a bookkeeper's ledger, which was exactly what it was. Thompson looked at the screen for a long time. He looked at the first entry from years earlier, a short time after a motorist filed a complaint about Bennett's conduct during a traffic stop on the waterfront. He looked at the most recent entry, a short time after a federal agent was beaten unconscious in a waterfront alley. His leather portfolio slipped off the edge of the table. He did not reach for it. He sat in the interview room chair with his hands flat on his knees and looked at the log and looked at the first agent who held his gaze steadily without expression, with the particular patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for the other person to understand it. "I'd like a lawyer," Thompson said. The agent nodded. "Of course." He reached over and closed the laptop. Then he said in the same unhurried tone, "Mr. Thompson, before your attorney arrives, the pension review process for federal civil rights convictions typically begins within a short period of indictment. I mention it only so you have accurate information." Inside. Thompson looked at the closed laptop. He looked at his portfolio on the floor, its contents fanned slightly across the linoleum. He did not pick it up. He sat in the chair with the specific stillness of a man for whom the floor has just stopped being the floor, for whom every system of support that has held him upright for years has, in the space of a short time, revealed itself to be something entirely different from what he had believed it to be. He sat there while the agent left to arrange the attorney request, and the room was quiet. And the only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent light and the distant sound of the building doing its work around him. Officer Mike Lawson had not slept. He had been brought to a separate interview room and offered coffee, which he accepted, and food, which he did not. He was still in his uniform, minus the duty belt, and the uniform felt in the quality of the fluorescent light in that room like something he was wearing for the last time, which was a feeling he had not anticipated having, and which had been sitting in his chest since roughly the moment he watched Ray Bennett's handcuffs click shut in the hospital room. He was young. He had joined because of his grandfather, who had worn a uniform for a long time with a clean record and a reputation the family still talked about. He had wanted that. Not the money, not the authority, but the specific, uncomplicated moral clarity of doing a job that helped people in moments when they most needed help. He could not stop seeing David Cole's face against the alley brickwork. Assistant United States Attorney Nicole Foster came into the interview room. She was methodical, with the economy of movement and language of someone who had spent years building federal cases. She did not perform warmth. She did not perform sternness. She simply sat down across from Lawson with a folder and looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had all the time she needed. "Officer Lawson," she said, "I want to tell you what we already know, and then I want to tell you what we're offering, in that order." She laid out the transmitter audio, described without playing it because she wanted Lawson to understand what was on it without the emotional impact of hearing it and potentially closing down. She described Bennett's body camera deactivation. She described Thompson's access log and what it showed. Then she placed a single document in front of Lawson. "Your body camera," she said. "You dimmed it. The audio remained active." Lawson looked at the document. He had known since the moment he chose to dim rather than fully deactivate, a decision made in a fraction of a second in the dark of the cruiser before they had even stopped, that this choice was either going to matter enormously or not at all. He had not known which. Now he knew. "It captured Officer Bennett's instructions to you in the cruiser," Foster said, prior to the stop. His characterization of what he intended to do, his guidance on report writing following the incident, and his statement that he had handled situations like this before and had people in place to make it disappear. She paused. "That's a significant piece of the evidentiary record, Officer Lawson. What we are offering is full immunity from prosecution for your role in the incident and the subsequent false reporting in exchange for your complete cooperation and your testimony at trial." She set the immunity agreement on the table between them. Lawson looked at it for a long time. Nicole Foster, who was very good at this, who had learned that the most important thing you could do in a room like this was hold still and let the silence work, did not move or speak. He thought about his grandfather, who had come home every night with his record clean and his conscience clean and had never, as far as Lawson knew, found himself in a room like this one facing a choice like this one. He thought about the figure on the wet asphalt curled against the baton, not fighting back, trusting something to eventually be right. He thought about standing at the perimeter. He thought about how the nod had felt and how it had continued to feel heavy and permanent in the center of his chest. He picked up the pen. His hand was completely steady when he signed. Not because he was unafraid, but because the fear and the decision existed in separate rooms inside him, and he had already locked the first one and was standing in the second. He set the pen down. He looked at the table. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Foster said, "you tell me everything from the beginning and we write it down." Sometime later, the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington occupied its appointed space in the federal courthouse downtown, with the particular gravitas of an institution that has been doing its work long enough to have forgotten that it once needed to assert its authority and now simply embodies it. Outside, on the morning that the trial of United States versus Ray Bennett began, there were news vans and a crowd that had gathered with the energy of people who understand that something significant is occurring, even if they cannot fully articulate what. Signs, some handmade, some printed with the careful design of organized advocacy organizations. A news crew from the local affiliate was setting up across the street. Inside the courtroom of the Honorable Judge Helen Whitaker, former civil rights attorney and federal appointee, the ambient temperature was cool and the light was the amber white of high-grade institutional fixtures. Judge Whitaker was precise in her language, precise in her application of procedural standards, and precisely intolerant of any attempt by any party to substitute performance for substance in her courtroom. At the defense table sat Ray Bennett in a gray suit that looked like it had been purchased for this occasion and had not been worn enough times to stop looking like that. He was thinner than he had been some time earlier. The holding facility and the pretrial period had redistributed the confidence that had previously occupied that physical space, replacing it with something more careful and considerably less comfortable. The defense attorney sat beside him with his leather portfolio and practiced composure, making small, neat notes. At the prosecution table, AUSA Nicole Foster arranged her materials with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been building this case and knew exactly where everything was and why it was there. Behind the prosecution table in the first row of the gallery sat David Cole. He wore a navy suit, tailored, well-maintained. A faint pale scar traced a line through his left eyebrow, the mark left by the orbital fracture's healing process, barely visible except in certain light and then clearly visible once you knew to look. When he held himself in the wooden gallery seat, there was a slight stiffness in his upper back, a subtle quality of care in how he settled his posture that was the residue of the rib fractures and would remain with him, his doctor had said, probably permanently. He looked at Ray Bennett with the expression of a man who has spent some time waiting for a room like this and has in that time come to understand that what he wants from it is not revenge, which is a feeling, but accountability, which is a fact. Behind David Cole, 2 rows back, sat a woman he had never met. Doris Kane wore her good coat, the one she kept for occasions, and held her purse on her lap with both hands. She had driven downtown from her apartment in a South Seattle neighborhood, parked a few blocks away, and walked to the courthouse because a federal agent's assistant had called her back sometime earlier and she had given a recorded statement. And then she had been told that her statement had been formally received and documented. And then she had been told the trial date and she had written it on her kitchen calendar in her careful, upright handwriting. She had not been subpoenaed. She was not a witness. She was simply a woman who had seen something through a chain-link fence late one night and had decided that seeing it all the way through mattered. Judge Whitaker entered. The courtroom rose and then sat. Nicole Foster presented the government's opening argument. She did not tell a story. She did not perform outrage. She laid out a sequence of documented facts, each one specific, each one sourced, each one connected to the next with the clean, deliberate logic of a woman who understands that a case built on facts does not need to be dramatized. The jury listened with the focused attention of people who had been waiting for the information that would make sense of why they were there. When she finished, she sat down. The defense attorney's opening was longer and less effective. It attempted to contextualize the incident within a framework of split-second decision-making under dangerous conditions, a narrative that would have been considerably more persuasive in the absence of a detailed audio recording, a body camera whose audio had been preserved, and a digital access log documenting years of complaint suppression. On a later day, Foster played a portion of the transmitter audio. The courtroom, which had been managing its attention with the trained patience of a room full of people doing their civic duty, went very quiet when the first sounds came through the speakers, not the dramatically quiet of people being performatively attentive. The actually quiet of people who were suddenly physically present in a dark alley in Seattle late at night, listening to what a baton does to a human body on wet concrete and to the voice of the man on the ground saying, "Federal agent," twice in a voice scraped raw by pain and blood. The recording lasted some time. When it ended, no one in the gallery moved. In the second row, Doris Kane had her hands folded in her lap. Her face was composed, but her knuckles were white against the dark wool of her coat. She had heard those sounds before, muffled and indistinct through chain link and rain. She had heard them clearly now for the first time. She did not look away. Officer Mike Lawson took the stand on a later day. He was wearing his dress uniform, not Foster's suggestion, his own choice. And when the defense attorney objected to the optics of it, Foster noted simply that a witness was entitled to wear whatever he chose. Lawson had chosen the uniform because he had joined the force to be a particular kind of officer, and walking into that courtroom in civilian clothes would have felt like a disavowal of something he still believed in. Even if he had for a critical period failed to live up to it, he was young, and he looked earnest, slightly pale, with the particular composure of someone who has made a difficult decision and is now committed to executing it regardless of the personal cost. He didn't look at Bennett when he was sworn in. Foster guided him through it methodically, starting at the beginning, the sector patrol. Bennett's words in the cruiser about instinct and belonging and finding the thing that does not fit. The moment the spotlight found David Cole in the alley. The stop. When Officer Bennett approached the subject, Foster said, "Did the subject display any sign of aggression or threatening behavior?" "No." Lawson's voice was steady. He had his hands visible at shoulder height before Officer Bennett reached him. He complied with every command immediately. When Officer Bennett conducted the pat-down and discovered the concealed firearm, did the subject reach for the weapon or make any movement toward Officer Bennett's person? A brief pause. Officer Bennett found it during the pat-down. Agent Cole's hands were flat on the wall the entire time. What happened immediately after the weapon was discovered? Lawson looked at his hands for a moment. A brief pause, not from reluctance, from accuracy, from the effort of a young man who has decided to be precise about something painful. Then he looked up. Officer Bennett grabbed Agent Cole by the back of his collar and drove his face into the wall. Then he pulled him backward and threw him down. Then he drew his baton. The gallery was very still. Before the physical contact began, Foster said, "Did Agent Cole announce that he had identification?" "Yes, twice." Lawson's voice was very even. "He said there was ID in his left breast pocket. He said it the first time before Officer Bennett initiated the pat-down. He said it a second time after the weapon was found. Officer Bennett told him he didn't care. What did you do during the beating?" The pause before Lawson answered was not long, but it was honest. "I stepped forward. I said, 'Wait.' Officer Bennett told me to watch the perimeter." He looked at his hands again. "I went back to the perimeter." Silence in the courtroom. "After the incident, what did Officer Bennett tell you?" "He told me to report it as an officer safety incident. He described Agent Cole's behavior, combative, lunging at his belt, refusing commands, and told me to write my report to reflect that description." Lawson's jaw was tight. "He told me that if I didn't back his account, my career was before it started. He said nobody would believe a rookie over a veteran." "Did you believe him?" A pause that contained in its few seconds something true and difficult and not comfortable to sit with. "I was young," Lawson said. "I'd been on the job for a short time." He looked at the jury directly. "I was afraid." Yes, I believed him. He did not add anything to that. He did not explain or justify. He simply let the fact of it sit in the courtroom air where it belonged. The defense attorney's cross-examination pressed Lawson on the immunity agreement, whether fear of prosecution had shaped his account, whether he was trading testimony for self-preservation. Lawson acknowledged the immunity agreement without deflection, and then stated simply that the account he had given was the account of what he had witnessed, and that the transmitter audio, which he had now heard in full, corroborated every element of it. The cross-examination did not recover what it had gone in to challenge. David Cole testified on a later day. He took the stand in the Navy suit and answered the preliminary questions in a voice that was measured, clear, and possessed of the specific authority of someone who has been trained in the accurate, unembellished reporting of facts. He walked the jury through the undercover operation from its origin, the weapons trafficking cell, the months of preparation, the mechanic, the scheduled contact window. He explained the transmitter and how it worked. He explained the operational protocol for law enforcement encounters during deep cover. When Officer Bennett began the physical contact, Foster said, "You had the physical capacity to defend yourself." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" David Cole was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was very still because doing so would have assaulted 2 law enforcement officers, ended the investigation, and risked being shot by a frightened rookie whose weapon was already drawn and aimed at his back. He paused. "And because the protocol exists for a reason. The bureau structure is designed to handle exactly this situation. I trusted the structure to do what it was designed to do." "Even while being beaten?" "Even then." He looked at the jury. "I said federal agent twice, loud enough to hear both times." He let that sit. Foster then played the transmitter audio in full. The courtroom sat in silence for some time. The jury listened to the rain and the commands and the compliance and the twice-announced identification that was not checked, and the sounds of the baton and the voice on the ground saying, "Federal agent," in a register scraped clean of everything except the essential information the man needed to convey. When it ended, one juror in the back row looked at her hands, then at the wall, then back at the witness box, where David Cole sat with his hands folded on the railing and his face composed and his eyes patient. In the gallery, Doris Kane was looking at her own hands. She had worked the overnight cleaning shift at the Harbor Building for years. She had walked past that alley many times. She had seen plenty of things in that neighborhood she could not do anything about, and she had learned to carry them and keep moving because that was what you did. She was done with that now. She had decided to be done with it the morning she called the FBI from her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. She had not known when she made that call what it would lead to. She knew now. She sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse and let herself be glad she had called. The defense rested without calling Bennett to the stand. The defense attorney made a brief closing argument that invoked the difficulty of split-second policing decisions and the importance of not judging them by the clarity of hindsight. He said it competently. It landed the way things land when the evidence has already decided the verdict and everyone in the room knows it. Foster's closing argument was concise. The last thing she said before she sat down was, "You have heard what happened. You have heard it in Agent Cole's voice, in Officer Lawson's testimony, and in a recording that captured every second of that alley late one night. The evidence does not ask you to believe anything. It simply asks you to listen." The jury deliberated for some time. Ray Bennett sat at the defense table during that time with a quality of stillness that was entirely unlike the stillness he had brought to years of police work. That stillness had been the stillness of a man at rest in a world arranged to his convenience. This was the stillness of a man holding himself in place against something that was pulling at him very hard. When the foreperson stood, Bennett's hands went to the edge of the table. He gripped it with both hands and his knuckles whitened, and he sat that way while the foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a gray cardigan who had been throughout the trial the juror whose face gave the least away, unfolded a sheet of paper and looked at it. "On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law," she said, and her voice was level and clear, "we the jury find the defendant Ray Bennett guilty." Someone in the gallery made a sound, suppressed quickly but present, the sharp intake of breath that is also a release, the sound of something held for a long time being allowed to let go. "On the count of assault on a federal officer, we find the defendant guilty." The defense attorney made a note on his legal pad with the mechanical action of a man doing the only thing available to him. "On the count of obstruction of a federal investigation, we find the defendant guilty." Bennett's hands tightened on the table edge until the table registered it, a slight, barely audible creak of pressured wood. Judge Whitaker received the verdict form, reviewed it, thanked the jury for their service, and set the sentencing hearing for a short time hence. The sentencing hearing was brief. The defense attorney offered mitigating circumstances, years of service, commendations in the file, no prior criminal record. He presented them competently and without apparent expectation that they would significantly alter the outcome. Judge Whitaker looked at Ray Bennett for a long, measured moment before she began. "Officer Bennett," she said, and her voice had the quality of a room cleared of everything except its essential function. "You were given a badge and a weapon and the authority to enforce the law in this city. You used those things as instruments of personal dominance over people you decided, based on criteria that had nothing to do with law enforcement, did not deserve the dignity your oath required you to extend to them." She let the silence after that sit for a moment. "You beat a man unconscious on a waterfront in the middle of the night, left him chained to a hospital bed, fabricated a criminal record for him, and instructed a junior officer to commit perjury to protect you. When you were arrested and the magnitude of your conduct became clear, your first and only response was to attempt to dismantle the evidence and destroy the career of a young officer who had the misfortune of being present that night." She paused again. "There are no mitigating circumstances that alter those facts. There are no years of service that make those choices defensible." She reached for her gavel. "Ray Bennett, I sentence you to a substantial term in a federal correctional facility to be served without the possibility of early parole." The sentence reflects the severity of the conduct, the deliberate and calculated nature of the cover-up, and the specific harm inflicted on a federal officer in the performance of his assigned duties. She brought the gavel down once, cleanly. Bennett's head dropped, not dramatically, not the collapse of a man undone by unexpected tragedy, but the slow, incremental lowering of someone whose body is acknowledging something the mind has already absorbed. He sat in the gray suit while the marshals moved toward him, and his hands, which had gripped the table edge during the verdict, were now simply resting on his thighs, doing nothing. In a separate proceeding sometime later, Bill Thompson received his sentence on multiple counts of civil rights conspiracy, a term in a federal minimum security facility, permanent revocation of his union credentials, and forfeiture of the pension he had spent years building. The judge noted in his sentencing remarks that removing institutional protection that enabled a series of incidents was not a passive act. It was participation. The sentence reflected that. In the corridor outside the courtroom, after Bennett's sentencing, the marshals moved him toward the side exit. He walked with the compressed quality of a man maintaining his posture by decision rather than inclination. As he passed the row of gallery seats near the exit doors, he turned his head. David Cole was standing near the courtroom doors. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his weight balanced and his suit buttoned. And he was watching Bennett with the same quality of attention he had brought to the investigation and the trial that followed. At present, measured, patient, not triumphant, not performing, just there, watching, holding the moment as exactly what it was. Bennett looked at him. David Cole held his gaze for a couple of seconds. Exactly that duration. Not the duration of a man making a point about dominance, but the duration of a man being fully present for the final beat of something that was now formally and completely over. Then he turned. He walked through the courtroom doors and into the corridor, which was ordinary and fluorescent and smelled faintly of industrial cleaning products. He walked toward the main exit, and outside the doors the light of Seattle was bright and cold and completely ordinary. The way the world always is after something significant has concluded and the world has no particular interest in commemorating it. He had a briefing in a short while. There was still work to do. Behind him in the gallery, Doris Kane gathered her purse and her coat and walked out into the same light. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, her breath visible in the cold air, and looked at the city. The buildings, the ordinary flow of traffic downtown, the clouds moving fast above the courthouse roof. Then she walked down the steps to the street and turned toward where she had parked her car a few blocks away. She had worked the overnight shift that night. She had taken the morning off to be here. She would go home, sleep a few hours, and go back to work. She had called. Someone had called back. Something had happened because of it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The federal undercover operation that David Cole had been running on that night was not destroyed by the arrest. It was paused, transferred to a different handler, and quietly resumed under a restructured cover framework. Sometime after his discharge from Harborview Medical Center, the trafficking cell's cross-field contact was eventually identified, flipped, and used to build a comprehensive federal case that concluded later. Multiple people were indicted across the region, including the logistics coordinator who had been the operation's primary target from the beginning. The weapons were seized. The network was dismantled. The work David Cole had been doing in that waterfront alley on a rainy night, trusting the structure to protect him while he absorbed what was being done to him, produced the outcome it had been designed to produce. David Cole returned to active duty on a Monday morning in early spring. He carried a faint scar through his left brow that caught light at certain angles, and a permanent stiffness in his upper back that was most noticeable in cold weather, the kind of weather that comes off the waterfront and stays. He had requested no commendation ceremony, issued no public statement, and spoken to journalists only through his attorney in brief statements that refused consistently to frame the experience in any language that placed him at the center of a narrative about himself. He was an FBI agent. He had been on an authorized operation. The structure had done what it was designed to do. He had work to complete. At the local precinct, Captain Ed Baxter retired quietly in the spring. The precinct's internal affairs function was placed under federal oversight for an extended period with quarterly reporting requirements and an independent monitor appointed by the district court. Officer Mike Lawson was reassigned at his own request to a community liaison unit in a different district, where he spent the following period learning methodically and without fanfare how to do the job the way his grandfather had done it, with consistency, with restraint, and with the professional honesty that costs something real to maintain and is for that reason worth maintaining. Doris Kane still worked the overnight cleaning shift at the Harbor Building. The building had new tenants now, a logistics company, ordinary work, ordinary hours. She still walked past the alley on her way to the parking lot at the end of every shift in all kinds of weather. She didn't stop when she passed it, but she always noticed it. She noticed it in the way that people notice the places where something true happened. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just with the quiet and permanent recognition that the place is marked, that something occurred there that mattered, and that she had been a part of making sure it mattered all the way through. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories where the truth finally catches up to power, and every one of them is worth telling. The rain-soaked alley in Seattle taught us something raw and unforgettable about the quiet power of doing what's right when everything in you wants to look away. In that moment, an FBI agent endured a brutal beating, not because he couldn't fight back. He could have ended it in seconds, but because he chose to trust the system, to protect a larger mission, and to believe that justice still had a heartbeat even when it looked completely broken. A young rookie officer, barely out of the academy, felt the weight of fear pressing on his chest, yet still found the courage to dim his body camera instead of turning it off completely, preserving the truth when it would have been so much easier to stay silent. And then there was the overnight cleaner, an ordinary woman heading home after a long shift who could have kept walking, but instead picked up the phone the next morning and made a call that changed everything. Their stories remind us that real courage rarely looks dramatic on the outside. It's the steady choice to speak when your voice shakes, to hold the line when the easy path is right in front of you, and to believe that one small act of integrity can crack open even the most stubborn wall of corruption. Power may wear a badge or hide behind paperwork, but it never gets the final word when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet. This story leaves your heart aching with the pain of injustice and then swelling with hope because truth really does catch up, often through the smallest, bravest decisions made in the dark. If this story moved you the way it moved me, if it stirred something deep about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you, drop a comment below and tell me, what's one moment in your life when you chose truth over silence? And if you believe stories like this still matter, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are more powerful tales where justice finds its way, and I can't wait to share them with you. Your voice and your support keep these stories alive. See you in the next one.